Hi everyone. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday evening. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Eileen. I am with Family Resource Navigators, and I am here to talk to you all about transition and the transition process from high school to what comes after high school, which is going to be different for everybody. And hopefully today, what we're going to try to do is give you an idea of what you need to think about and what you should be asking for and what you should be planning for so that transition should not be a surprise. Um, that's always the message that I have for people when I'm talking to them about transition. Transition should be the natural process of what happens next for you. And it shouldn't be something that comes as a surprise for you. It shouldn't be something that, comes out of the blue. And it's really important to be thinking about that and to be planning for what you want to do next or what the youth that you are working with wants to do next. So let's think about what we're going to do today. There is a law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what we want to do is review the required transition planning and services component under that state and federal law. Now, that law itself is a federal law. It has been enacted into the state and it was last verified in 2004. And at that time, it became a permanent part. It doesn't have to be reauthorized. So this is something that's unlikely to change, right? We want to understand how adult decision making takes place within this process of transition because we want to really be thinking about how does a person get to where they want to go and how do we help them to get there. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what are the kinds of options, right? Because what we often find in transition plans is people are talking about a very narrow set of issues or a narrow set of things that affect your life. But really, transition is supposed to be about everything in your life. So it's really important to remember that. And as we're going to be talking, to be asking about those kinds of things and planning for those kinds of things. So, as I said, this is part of the law called the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, and that's specifically the part of the law it's for. And what people often don't remember is that IDEA has some aims in it. It has specific things that it's supposed to be doing. One, it's supposed to help people with disabilities get to further education. That education could be going to a community college, it could be going to a four-year college, it could be vocational education, it could be training or internships. But the idea is that the purpose of all of special education, in part, is to get the person receiving special education onto further education if that's what they want. The second thing that IDEA is supposed to do is to help people get to employment, whatever that next level is for them. For some people, that's going to be competitive employment, a job that you just apply for and get. Other people will want employment with supports, right? But the idea is that employment in all its forms should be something that we're talking about as we're talking about transition, right? All of these things should not be new, they should not be different, they should just be part of what we're seeing as the next step. And then the final part of what we see for transition is independent living. And this is the idea of thinking about how this individual is going to live. Again, they might just want to go out and rent an apartment. They also may need some help with living. But all of those things have to be planned for in the process of transition. Just a second. So, what are transition services themselves? And transition is a very particular part of this law, this Individual with Disabilities Education Act. And the idea of transition, and this is mostly out of the law, so it's a little bit of a complicated language. But the things that I want you to take away from it is one, it should be results oriented. In other words, it shouldn't be some vague promise about what's going to happen next. It shouldn't be, oh, this person will find a career of some sort, right? That's not a transition plan. That's not a transition goal. But it should be something that we should be able to measure. right? Have we been successful in helping this person move forward from school activities into that next level, which could be vocational, integrated employment, supported employment, continuing education, adult services, independent living, community participation. It can be any or all of the above, depending on who the person is, right? And the second thing I want you to remember about transition is that it should be based on that individual's needs. A lot of times when I'm talking to students and I'm talking to parents about transition, they'll say, well, my district has a transition program and everybody goes to the same transition program. And they think that that is the right way to go, that that transition program, one size fits all, is what works for them. But it's really important to remember that just like in the IEP, that this should be based on that individual's strengths, preferences, and interests, right? So for a while, a lot of the districts were doing transition programs where they were having people work in, do jobs in certain industries. So they might be working at Safeway, they might be working at a restaurant, they might be working at a bookstore or something like that. So all those different kinds of places where people might work. And that's great if that's what the person wants. It's not great if it's not what the person wants, right? So it's really important to remember that just because the district has a transition program, that doesn't mean it's the right one for you or for your child, depending on who you're talking about. It should be based on that person's individual strengths, preferences, and interests. And this means that it includes instruction, right? That's usually the part that the school is doing some kind of academic instruction, related services, community experiences, right? The development of employment and other adult activities, school or living objectives. And if appropriate, it should also focus on daily living skills. And this is another place where I often find schools are saying, hey, this is not what we do. We do education. We don't do daily living skills. And it's really important for the people who need that acquisition of daily living skills for that to be part of their program. So that when you're thinking about this and you're going into the transition meetings, right, and you're talking about transition, and we're going to talk about when the district has to do that in the IEP process, you don't want them to just say, well, this is what we've got, and your youth or you will be starting in the fall. If it fits you, then that's great. But if it doesn't fit you, you want something that does. And that's one of the really important parts of the transition process. Why am I harping on transition? Because the track record is really bad, right? If you look at the college enrollment rate for young adults who identify as people with disabilities, it's only 27.5% compared to 43% for people without disabilities. If you think about medical homes, right, someplace where you have a doctor who knows you, which is also an important part of transition, particularly for people who have chronic medical conditions. CDC reported in 2024 that only 1 in 4 people with disabilities has a regular medical provider, right? And then if you look at the Department of Labor, we had our highest percentage last year, which is 37% of people with disabilities 16 to 64 were employed. However, there was a great deal more of part-time employment than there are for people who don't have disabilities. Um, and it's still substantially lower. And the rates that people get paid are substantially lower. Those with a disability earned a median of $28,000 compared to $40,000 for people without a disability. So the track record so far for transition, for the things it's supposed to get people to, employment, um, greater education, independent living, a good life, it's not fabulous. And that's why it's really important to plan. And I think this was one of the ones that struck me the hardest, which was this national study, which found that housing is very limited for people with developmental disabilities. And by that, I mean people who are clients of the regional center in addition to getting special ed. Disability Scoop reported a study in 2020 that 75% of the adults with developmental disabilities were living with their parents and they had no plans for the future, right? So it's really important for all of us to be thinking whether we're advocating for other people, we're advocating for a child in our family, or we're advocating for ourselves, that transition is the place where the law is saying you're supposed to get help becoming an adult. And for most people, it's not working. So, this planning and preparation for the transition process is really essential for getting those positive outcomes, right? And this is something that districts are often talk about transition in a very short sort of way. They might have 10 minutes or 15 minutes in an IEP for a transition. But a transition's about the rest of your life, right? So 10 or 15 minutes in an IEP doesn't really cut it. So you really want to start thinking about what is it that I want if you are the person who is the focus of the transition, if you're the student in special education, or what does my child want, or what does the person I'm advocating for want? Because it's really essential to have a good transition plan in order to have positive outcomes. So right now, the way the law is that transition services are required to be part of the law. This is federally from 16 on, though you can start asking for transition at 14, right? And I usually advise most people to be thinking about it. Honestly, there is a plan for you at every age, right? If you are in a regular education classroom and you are doing regular education work, then it is planned that you are going to be able to graduate by the time you are in 12th grade, right? And many of those people are deliberately and knowingly tracking certain classes that they need to take so they can go on to our California state universities or our universities of California. Other people are planning on going to community colleges or doing vocational training or getting a job. Everybody has some kind of plan implicit. The difference is that you really have to talk about it. And 14 to 16 is really when you want to start talking about it and not in a way of just 10 minutes in a meeting, oh, this is my goals, but really starting to explore and having a process where you really take years to figure out what do you want next, right? And how do I get there? And when you're thinking about these plans, which officially have to be in the IEP after 16, there are really two very important parts. One is what are the post-secondary goals, right? What is going to be the next step for this person? Where are we trying to get to? And the second is what are the services and the transition services and the transition activities that are going to be part of this IEP? So just like the IEP goals, right? All those IEP goals we have in the IEP, the transition goals should be measurable. They must be written with a result in mind, and you should be able to know if the goal is accomplished. If you're if you wrote goals for the transition and you're sitting there at 22 years old, or you're advocating for somebody who's 22 years old and you don't really know whether they got to the goals or not, those weren't good goals, right? By definition. The goals should have a result in mind. And they should also focus on what happens after high school. They shouldn't be focused just on what is going on in high school. I've seen people with transition goals for people, for example, who are interested in going to community college, and their transition goal is focused on them, maybe going over to the community college and finding out what happened. Well, that's one good step, but it might not be the only step that they need. So you don't want to have something that's just part of the process of getting you there as your transition goals, but you want to have the end goal. So instead of this student will investigate about about community colleges, the transition goal should be this student will attend a community college of their choice. Big difference, right? In one, we're just talking about the process. In the other, we're talking about the endpoint. Any questions so far about where we're going with this? You're welcome to raise. We talked about in the beginning how we're not going to have our specific questions about individual students right now, and that we're glad to do those after we turn off the recording because we don't want to have those on the recording. But if you have questions about the process or about what I've talked about, please feel free to raise your hand. Go ahead, Gomati.
Hi, Eileen. So you mentioned the goal should be about based on what the student wants. So sometimes students are not clear about what they want.
Who
Uh,
is?
exactly. Yes. And sometimes the goal is not very realistic, right? Um, so 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 how do you navigate at that point?
Right. So part of it is that, all of us have dreams of what we want to do, right? All our lives we have dreams. Many of us have unrealistic goals of what we want to do, right? But then we start to explore them and we find out that maybe they are unrealistic, right? Or maybe we try them out. So part of this there is a time of discovery and exploration, which is why if you just make it a very short thing, you're not going to have that time of discovery and exploration, right?
Mhm.
So I can say that, at 5 years old, I wanted to be a ballerina. I am not a dancer. Any way, shape, or form, I am not a dancer, right? And I sort of found that out relatively quickly by taking a couple of dance classes, right? And then maybe when I was 16, I thought, well, maybe I'll be an attorney. And so I did an internship in an attorney's office, and I went, oh no, I don't want to do this either, right? And I ended up I'm a historian and a political scientist by training. That was what I trained to do. And so it is something that evolves over time.
Mhm.
Transition goals can evolve over time. And there should be a time of discovery and exploration and not locking people into things, right? But if you're
Mhm.
starting transition at the very last point, then people grab onto something and say, this is what you're going to be, right?
Yep.
And people don't have that opportunity, which is why when other students are exploring these things, right, we want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to explore things. So I know, for example, that I have two children, one who had an IEP and one who did not. My daughter was given the opportunity to, in one of her classes, the same class my son had taken just a year before, and in that class, they were emailing people to find out what their jobs were like, right? And at
Mhm.
that time, my daughter was fascinated with forensic science, right? And so she was, talking to all these people. What kind of degrees do you have? What kind of work do you do? How's the job? And they had a set of questions to ask. Never did that with my son. Same class, right?
Mhm.
So it's making sure that the kinds of exploration that we do with everybody are done with people with disabilities, right? Because
Got it.
that's how we find out what's realistic for us, right?
Yep.
Anybody else before we move on? Okay, thank you, Gomati. So those transition goals should be, based on assessments, because in part, as I said, for most kids, we start talking to them about this in middle school, it's sixth, seventh grade, right? We start doing transition inventories, personality inventories. We start identifying what their strengths and weaknesses are. Um, we may also be looking at things like how ready are they for independent living or work readiness. And work readiness is often a really important issue for people because one of the things I always remind people when we're talking about transition is to be able to function as an adult in society. Most of the studies I've looked at say you need a sixth grade reading level. It's not greatly, it's not tremendously high, but it's a sixth grade reading level. Thinking about that, if we have an individual who wants to live on their own, who wants to be able to do things on their own, then it's going to be really important that we get them to that sixth grade reading level, right? So I was just checking what the thing was. Sorry about that. But it is really important to think about what do you need to get to where you want to go. And so if somebody is having difficulty reading, starting reading instruction or great reading instruction or peer-reviewed reading instruction when somebody's in 11th or 12th grade or in transition is not as effective as if we started it in fifth, or fourth, or third grade, right? So we want to be thinking about what are the things that want to get there because you always have a plan in your head, right? You always have a dream in your head and you really want to be pushing toward that all along. And so as we get more to the transition plan, we want to do things like direct observations, inventory, job training and analysis, going out into the community, finding out all of these things, as well as looking at people's academics in order to start to hone those dreams from maybe ones that are not realistic to ones that are workable for this person, right? Sorry. Which means that we should have baselines because the other thing that we often don't measure in transition is have we made any progress? If we don't have a baseline of where you are, then we don't know how far you've come with the services the school gives you. And a lot of times we're missing baselines when we're looking at transition plans. So we might have baselines related to education. There is an implicit baseline here in California. That's that A to G standard, right? In order to go to a UC or a Cal State University, you have to have completed that A to G standard, right? There is an implicit standard. So if we have somebody who has a disability who wants to be college bound, we should be looking at that every year. And again, we may be refining, we may be thinking about what is reasonable, realistic, and achievable to them. But we shouldn't just pretend that it doesn't exist, right? And only talk about it when they're in 11th or 12th grade. So transition plans should include those measurable goals, those baselines, and a statement of the needed special education and related services and supplemental aids and services that should be provided to the child, to the youth, right? So we're having our baselines, we're having our assessment, we have our goals. And so the question then is, how do we get there? Part of those services are being done by the school district, and the school district is supposed to be saying, what are those services that you need to get there? So, for example, if we had somebody who maybe wasn't yet reading at the sixth grade level at 16 years of age, and they wanted to be living independently, then one of the important things I would be asking for is reading, right? Instruction for that individual, because that's going to be a special education service they're going to need to get to the next level. If somebody is going on to the college and needs those A to G requirements, then I'm going to be talking about how are we going to get those A to G requirements for this individual in order to get them to where they need to go. If somebody has no idea of what they want to do, then I'm going to want to start planning. How do we start a discovery and community relations for this person to start getting them out there in the community to figure out what do they want to do? What brings them joy? What kind of work do they want? What kind of passions do they have in their life, right? Because otherwise, they just pass normally from grade to grade. They go into a transition program that everybody goes into, and they graduate with no real plan, right? And that's what we don't want to have happen. But it is important to remember as you're thinking about this that transition is not just the responsibility of either the school or the family, right? Because most of the time when we're thinking about kids' development, we're thinking about the schools for academics. And by academics, I'm broadly talking about education, including things like reading, writing, but also group activities, socialization, communication, all that kind of stuff, right? And part of that is usually the responsibility of the school, and part of that is often the responsibility of the family, right? Because there's a balance. But in in IEPs where the services and supports are usually provided by just the school district, right? Then that's usually what we're just referring to in the IEP. Transition activities may be the responsibilities of other agencies. And in such cases, the school's role is not to fund the activities, but to bring in the involvement and coordination of those organizations that can provide these other services, right? And so what are some of the examples of some of these places that might provide these other services? It might be the regional center if the person is a client of the regional center. It might be disability services if the student is going to UC Berkeley, right? It might be the Department of Rehabilitation if the person is going to have a plan to have a job and to, as a person with a disability, they want to get services to help themselves. The school's role is to facilitate their involvement, right? But the financial responsibility for meeting a student's transition plan is never meant in this law to apply solely to the education system, but that the school team, the IEP team, should be helping to get there through those ones that fall into their purview, the academics. So part of what we're doing when we're talking about transition is saying, okay, so what parts of this are going to be done in the school? What parts of this may be done by the Department of Rehabilitation? What parts of this may be done by regional center? What parts of this may be done by going to the disability student office? All of those things are part of what you're doing when you're talking about transition. And so we have our goals, which are based on our assessments and this person's dreams of where they want to go, right? And what they want to do in living, independent living, in education, and in employment, right? Those are always the big three that you want to keep in your head. And then, so we start building those transition services and activities, which are designed to include that instruction that I just talked about, as well as community experiences. They should be results oriented. They should be designed to improve the academic and functional achievement of the student. That's why it's so important that it's measurable. If things are not measured, it is virtually impossible to figure out whether they improve things, right? So it's really important to say, well, and let's return to that student who is 16 years old and who maybe is reading at fourth grade level. Well, we want to get them to fourth grade half year or fifth grade level at the end of the year because we have our broader transition goal, which is this student wants to live independently, right? And then our academic goal that's going to support that is this student needs to have a certain level of competence in reading and probably in mathematics, right? In order to be able to live independently. And so that's how we're thinking about it. We're thinking about a big goal and then our little goals as well. So those transition plans, they provide the frame around the future. And then those yearly IEP goals fit within that bigger frame and help you move forward to the next step, right? So while transition goals, they can and do change because people change what they want to do because all of us change, right? You might have been headed toward college when you were in 11th grade, and then you decided, hey, no, I don't want to do that. I would much rather be a carpenter, and you start to look for an apprenticeship, right? That might be your life plan. And that is allowable, encouraged, and okay for everybody, right? People don't have to lock themselves in. But those yearly goals in the plan that you put in for your transition goals, those yearly IEP goals are what help you move the next step forward, right? And so those goals are the ones that are year to year, that you really want to be measurable, that you really want to see that progress, that are going to support the things that the person wants to do in the future. So again, for a student who might want to attend college, the IEP goals might focus on study skills. Um, One of the biggest ones that I see in IEPs is what we call executive function, the ability to organize yourself, right? And you get a lot of support, especially if you have an IEP in high school and middle school. You get some support in college, but not a lot. And if you are not good about thinking about when are the different things due and how do I make sure that they come in, you're going to have problems, right? Or if you can't balance when do I study for this class versus when do I do the labs for that class, it's going to be difficult for you to progress through your education. So thinking about those kinds of things for somebody with an IEP, it's not just exploring colleges, but do I have the study skills, the prerequisites, the graduation requirements that I need, right? Those would be the sorts of things we would be talking about and we would be focusing on for our yearly goals. And then for students who want employment as the goal, the IEP goals might focus on their job readiness. I also am on a lot of IEPs where we're writing about, we're writing goals about timeliness because employers don't like you to be 20 minutes late. And we have a lot of students who think being 20 minutes late is absolutely okay. And so they show up late. And that's not a job readiness skill. It's a lot of those soft skills, how to interview, how to talk about yourself, making sure that you're presentable when you go to an interview, or how to work, how to be business appropriate in your attire. All those kinds of things some people might need, and therefore we would put those into the yearly goals. The big goal, this person wants a job in such and such an industry. We can go back and say they want to be a carpenter or they want to be a hairdresser, or I had one student who wanted to be a rock star, right? And again, so what are the steps to get there, right? What are the steps? And he wasn't even in a band yet, so we had to get him there, right? So the first thing for him was to find a band, right? To bring his music up. Again, we don't want to stomp on somebody's dreams because everybody deserves to dream about their future, but we want to help them to get to the next steps in those goals for getting to there. And so you have to take that big goal, break it down year to year. The school takes on their part, the parents take on their part, and other agencies take on theirs. And that's a really important part of transition. It's really different than the rest of the IEP process in that way. Got to stop again. Any questions about that? We good? Okay. So, what transition says is that there must be a transition plan. This is part of the federal law by the time somebody's 16, and that the school is supposed to make sure that any IEP that the student's transition is being discussed has the student attend. They're supposed to be invited to attend the IEP if they are being talked about, right? So again, this is really the issue of nothing about me without me, right? So the transition plan can include discussing what the student wants for their future, what their needs or challenges are, what the barriers are for them, what accommodations or supports they're going to need. The other part that I want people to know, which not everybody thinks about, is that parents must be notified. The purpose of the meeting is to develop a statement of transition services and needs for their child, um, as the districts and the districts should be inviting people to the meeting. One of the things that families often don't know, is that the age of majority is 18. And therefore, once the student becomes 18, all rights revert to that student. This can be very uncomfortable for families, who have been really accustomed to being the voice of their student in the IEP meeting, right? Because at 18, unless your student gives you the right to do that, you are no longer the voice of that student. So it is important that education to know that the educational decision-making rights revert to the student at 18 unless the student is conserved, right? Unless there's a conservatorship, then the parents can retain the rights. And I want to just spend a little bit about time on this. This is something that FRN has been working on. We've been working on a project about students retaining their decision-making rights, people with disabilities retaining their decision-making rights after 18. And so I want to point out, if you use your camera and you click on the QR code, and I'm more than glad to email this slide deck to anybody who wants it. There is an agreement that students can sign that allows their parents to continue to act on their behalf, right? This is something written by Disability Rights California. It basically is the same kind of advocacy agreement a special ed advocate would sign with a parent that says, hey, I can act on the behalf of this person, but this is a place where the student can ask their parents to act on their behalf. And the reason I want to take this little pause is because I still hear a lot of schools recommending conservatorship for students who have developmental disabilities in particular, or who have mental health problems. And this, I want to recognize that there are people for whom conservatorship is exactly the right choice, and that's wonderful advice. But it is really important to also know that there are alternatives to conservatorship for students. And that's part of what we want to make sure is that the student is able to take place in this discussion. And I think that's such an important part of this. But the parents can still support them, or that student can choose other people to support them, because there's a new California law called AB 1663, which allows people with disabilities to choose people to support them in these kinds of decisions without being conserved, right? Because I think what often happens is, if you indicate that you need support, if I have a student who indicates that they want their parents to continue to help them, or they want a social worker to help them, or they want a teacher to help them, that this can be weaponized against them, right? And be used as a reason of, well, they can't make decisions themselves, so that they should get a conservatorship. And I'm just going to be completely out there and say, I rarely make decisions myself. I almost always get people to help me with my decisions. I often don't like, there are days I don't want to call people on the phone. I say, my husband, you call them, right? You call them. I'm not going to call them today. Or I have a decision to make that I ask somebody else, or I get emotional in a situation and my daughter will speak for me, or somebody else. Now that's being normalized for people with disabilities, and they can use something called supported decision making, or SDM, and this is a choice. So if the school district tells you, or the families you're working for, or your child, that they have to have conservatorship, that's just blatantly not true. That is one choice, and it might be the right one for some families. But there's also this idea that you can continue to use supported decision making. And supported decision making is actually a great way to help people in the transition process. So supporters can find and create materials for the person to understand. So one of the things that I usually tell families is a good idea, and students is a good idea, is to have some kind of presentation, paper, film, slide deck, whatever they want to do, right? That kind of starts talking about what they're thinking about for their life. And helping that person do that is often um, a goal I put in IEPs prior to this, right? So at the 15-year-old or the 14-year-old IEP, I'm often putting in this idea of, let's have the special education staff work with this individual, or the counselor work with this individual, to start thinking about what they want to present at this meeting, right? So people can help them to create materials that they can understand. We can help them create materials that other people can understand. They can present materials in a way that's accessible for somebody. They could build in extra time. Honestly, one of the things that I think is the most stressful about any special education meeting is how fast they try to go, right? You get there and it's like, okay, we're done, right? And you might not be done. And this person might not be done. Or this might be a person who needs more time processing. So, one of the things that supporters can do is to say, one of my favorite lines in an IEP, and I am very grateful that we get to say this in California is we're not signing today, right? We're not going to sign anything today. We'll come back and we'll have another meeting and we'll talk about it some more, but we're going to need some time just to process things, right? And that's absolutely okay. So that's one way you can help somebody. You can act as a note taker or review choices with some people later on. Because again, it might be overwhelming for the adult with a disability who, to sit there in a meeting with three, four, eight people who are on their IEP team who are asking them to make a decision in the moment. That might not work for them, right? But you might be able to bring notes home and help them to review and make those decisions. You can also help them with asking questions, either at this meeting or another meeting, as well as discussing options, right? All of this is just supporting somebody in the meeting. And honestly, these are the kinds of things that, advocates do for parents when we're supporting parents in the meeting. This is pretty much the same set of things, but they can also be done for people with disabilities who are trying to make sure that they are the centerpiece of the transition process because that's such an important part. So transition should be focused on that student and their future. Um, Student participation is seen as central, right, to it. And some people feel very comfortable. I've had students who were very comfortable and took control of their meetings when they came. I've had students who maybe were not, couldn't communicate quite as easily and they might have been less comfortable. So there's all kinds of ways of bringing that person into the centerpiece of the meeting. We can gather information about the student outside of the meeting if somebody feels very shy or their communication, um, the, they feel uncomfortable communicating in that. It can be a series of conversations. It can be a person-centered plan, but this should be about a person, not just about their transition program. And again, the goals and the activities can be built into those IEPs in the years approaching transition around decision making and self advocacy to help prepare for adult life. Because frankly, we don't all suddenly become brilliant decision makers at 18 years of age, right? For the most part, we have practice. So, one of the things that I often say to people is make sure that your student has practice coming into the IEP process so this is not a surprise. So for my son who had an IEP, I gave him his decision-making rights at 14. I formally wrote a letter to the district and said, I am ceding my decision-making rights, my educational decision-making rights for my son back to him. And my son has cerebral palsy. Communication is difficult for him. And so this was, the district was put back a little bit by my decision. They were used to talking to me, and I'm a talker, right? And they were used to that. And so they came in and they brought him, his plan for that year, and they brought him his goals for that year, and they read them to him. And I'm looking at my son, and he doesn't seem enthralled. And I said, you know, Will, have you heard these before? Have you seen these before? And no, never heard them before, never saw them before. And I said, are you in agreement with these goals? Is this what you want to work on for this year? And he just went, right? Because the district wasn't treating him as a decision maker or a person, right? He's in ninth grade. He's getting to be an adult. They were treating, and they do treat other children, neurotypical children that way, but they weren't treating my son that way. And it was an amazing turnaround that suddenly, before every IEP, they talked to him about his goals, right? Because they didn't want, I sent them away. I said, you got to come back. Obviously, you got some work to do, right? Because your decision maker is not agreeing with what your plan is for the year. And as a result, it made him much more of a focus of what they did, right? The other thing that I've had students do is do an evaluation of the year, right? Some students feel very comfortable about this, some students don't. But to come to the meeting and to spend the first 10 minutes of the meeting saying in their idea, in their feeling, how did the meeting go, or to write it out, or to do a video, whatever is comfortable for them, but to bring that information into the meeting so that people know, hey, this is your client here, right? Not the parent, but this student. And how do they feel about what you want to do, right? So we really want to get to that point where we make the student the centerpiece because this is about them. This is about their future. This is about their life. And at 18, unless the parents have conserved that person, um, they are the decision maker. And what I want to say is that conserving is not the only choice, right? We have other trainings on how to use STM in other places. And if you're interested, let us know. We'd be glad to. We can coach you on it individually. We can have you attend one of our other trainings on it. But the idea is that there are lots of ways, short of conservatorship, to have people with disabilities get the support they need without having to get their rights permanently taken away. In some cases, again, parents know what's best. We're not going to judge anybody's choices, but we want people to know there are options. Any questions about that before I move on for what are some of the options after school?
Eileen, you do have a couple of questions that were inside the chat room.
Okay, you want to
Uh,
tell me what they are since I can't see it
Sure,
when I have it on this display?
sure. One of our parents asked, are both parents are notified, or is it the one parent with ed rights holder driving it with whom the school is accustomed to interfacing or making contact?
Yes,
Also,
normally that would be normally who the school would notify, the person that they perceived as the decision maker. Sometimes if it is a 50-50 custody agreement, then they will notify both. But if one person has 51% or more, then they will usually only notify that decision maker.
and then we have some thank yous for clarifying. And another person said, highlighting the student's interest and engaging them in both decision making and preparing materials. It's so wise. Thank you, Eileen.
It's also really fun, right? To be able to do those kind of things and to talk about those kinds of things and to say, what are you thinking about for your future and what do you want to do and where do you want to go? And those are important parenting questions as well. And the school has responsibilities for it, but it's also a place where we can help our students to take agency, right? And I think that that's often something that people with disabilities have to fight for, their own agency, their own decision making. And so we really want to make sure that this is not in the same way that every young adult starts to argue with their parents. We want to encourage and enable that for people with disabilities so that they can form their own life. They can form their own independence. And this is going to differ from different cultures and in different personalities and in different people, but we also want to make sure that we create that place. And I always say, um, if if your child has never disagreed with you or made a choice that you don't like, they don't have agency, right? Because every person makes a decision that somebody doesn't like, right? You might like most of them, but if you like all of them, then you might want to think of backing off a little bit. All right. So when we're talking about these things that we're planning for, what are we planning for here in California? What are some of the possible after high school options for transitioning students? The first, I just want to talk about living options, and I will apologize that I'm going through tons of stuff really quickly. And again, if you need help, call us. We have a parent training and we have a family empowerment center at FRN. We're more than glad to help you to understand these things better. Some adults want to live independently in an apartment or a home. They might go to market rate rentals, but there are also below market rate units for low income individuals. Um, Usually it's about 30% of people's income. And for students, They also may have them for students as well. I know that my daughter lived in a below market rate apartment when she was at UC Berkeley, right? Um, there are also Section 8 housing vouchers for those who qualify, which basically are kind of a more permanent version where where you can use the voucher at different places and get about that 30% rate of what your income is. Section 8 vouchers are really, really hard to come by, right? I believe we waited for 7 years for ours and we got it pretty quick. So it's probably easier to look for that the low income or below market rate units, which there are a fair number in Alameda County and Contra Costa County, than trying to get a Section 8. And if you ever see Section 8 lists open, jump on them because they close, right? You get on them for a while and then they work off a waiting list. And it can be years for people waiting to get on those lists. So when they're open, you kind of have to jump right on them. For those who are looking for communal living experiences, people who are clients of the regional center is vendorized with family homes, which are usually a home, just like it sounds, run by, usually a family or a couple who are have a couple of people, 2 or 3 people with disabilities living in the home. There are community care facilities, some with medical or behavioral specialties. There are also intermediate care facilities for people with complex medical conditions, which can be funded by Medi-Cal. So while housing here in the Bay Area is really hard to find, we do have a greater abundance than other families I've worked with throughout the country in terms of low income housing and housing available, as well as the kinds of things that the regional center has. Most of the other places that I talk to, because I teach advocacy nationally, people will tell me for group homes, there's a 5-year waiting list in their state, right? That's really common to hear. That's not true here in California. You can also get help living at home. So support for that daily living can be provided by Regional Center through supported living services. That's for people who are living outside of the home. By coordinated family services, which is provided for people who are living with their parents, and independent living services, which are services that help you learn to be independent. So, say you wanted to look for an apartment and maybe learn how to do your own shopping and budgeting, then you might be asking the regional center to fund independent living services. And we're going to also talk about how these are also the kinds of things that can be funded under the Department of Rehabilitation for people who are not regional center clients. Um, Eligible Medi-Cal recipients may receive in-home supported services and the home and community-based waiver, both of which can provide assistance at home. So one of the things I'm always telling people is just because you need help at home doesn't mean you can't live independently. You can get those supports, right? Education options, right? And again, assistance in funding education or vocational training can be available for eligible students from the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. Some of that exploration that we're talking about, the Department of Rehabilitation has pre-graduation services, pre-18 services. I believe they're from 16 on. And they can help you to do some of those community explorations of the kind of work you might want to do. So it's important to have that organization in your mind. And Voc Rehab or DOR, it's called both depending on where you are, is probably the most underused service in the country, right? People who are eligible for it don't apply. And it's a really important one to apply for. Gomati, go ahead.
Eileen, can you elaborate a little bit about this coordinated family services?
Sure.
In the previous slide.
Sure. Coordinated Family Services is a new program of the Regional Center. It started in 2023, and Coordinated Family Services can do two different things. One, it can help navigate families to supports in the community that they may need. So, um, people may not know that their adults with disabilities, even living at home, may qualify, for example, for CalFresh in order to supplement their food. So it can help navigate you to those things. But coordinated family services can also provide people in the home to provide respite or assistance for the parents up to 24/7, right? So it used to be until 2023, there wasn't a way, if somebody didn't, if you needed nursing, you could get 24/7 services for somebody, and you couldn't get it in any other way. But after 2023 and this new coordinated family services, now people can get those aid services, for the full day. And that's been very important for families. For example, a lot of families had, they might have a youth living at home, and they're not really sure what they want to do next, but they can't really do some things by themselves. Coordinated family services can help you find a day program that might be appropriate for them, or help them go out into the community, or attend their church, or do whatever they want to do, right? So that's another program that's of the regional center. It's still in its piloting phase, but there are providers both in Alameda and Contra Costa County. Does that help?
Thank you.
You're
Yes,
welcome.
definitely. Thank you.
Okay. So again, Voc Rehab, very underutilized. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago that basically said that maybe 1/5 of the people who are eligible for Voc Rehab actually have it, right? So it is an important service to be applying for. And the idea of vocational rehabilitation is that it helps people to find a career, to find jobs, um, to get hopefully competitive work, though they also do supportive work, so that these people will not have to rely on Social Security for their living. And so people need to have a plan or an idea, or they need to be exploring ideas for work. But Voc Rehab can pay for a lot of stuff, so it's really important to know what they can do. Um, I also want to just kind of do some of the education options. Students can attend a 4-year college. There is that A through G requirements, right? That's important if they're going there. So preparation should start early. Students might work with the Disabled Student Services to request accommodations. I used to be a college professor. There are no IEPs in college, guys, right? You got to ask for your accommodations. So if a student is college bound, one of the things I always put into their transition plan is learn to advocate for themselves for their accommodations, because people forget to do it or they get embarrassed, right? So that's always a big one for me. Students also can attend a community college. You don't have to have a high school diploma to attend a community college, and people can transfer from a community college to a 4-year college if they meet, certain criteria. Um, so those are all there. There's also colleges that allow people to do what they call a college or career program, which is often for people who um, maybe don't want to, do a college living, but they want to have that college experience. There's a growing number of those. There's one at UC Davis. There's one, I think, in Fresno. There's one at College of Alameda. So there's a growing number of these kinds of things available. There are colleges, these are mostly for pay, private colleges that have enhanced supports for students with learning challenges. And we already talked a little bit about the ones for the experience of college life. And then there are also external college support programs that can assist with various issues like tutoring, executive functioning, and independent living. So there's a lot out there just from the college level. But there's also vocational and technical training, right? There's the regional occupational centers and programs, of which there's one in Fremont, right? So students can learn from those places to start vocational training. They can get business training. They can get industrial training. And many of these are cooperative programs with the Department of Rehabilitation, where they have these vocationally focused services to help individuals with disabilities to get to live independently and to get competitive integrated employment. So DOR is really flexible. It might be something for somebody who is headed toward employment, right? It might be for somebody who is headed toward additional education. But the idea is behind DOR that you have a plan, and that plan is going to help you toward competitive integrated employment. And there's my friend DOR, right? DOR administers the largest vocational rehabilitation and independent living services in the country, right? Um, it is designed to help job seekers with disabilities obtain competitive employment. Independent living services may include peer support, skill development, systems advocacy, referrals, assistive technology, transition services, housing assistance, and personal assistance services. So they are pretty broad. So if you have not looked into them, get on their website and look in, right? Because they're a very important player in the transition process. And these services are available both before graduation in their youth program, as well as after graduation for eligible recipients. And I want to also talk a little bit about the employment opportunities that are out there. So DOR has supported employment that provides activities and services, including those kinds of ongoing support, right? Including a focus on students with the most significant disabilities. And they do have coaches, and that usually lasts for about 24 months with them. But the regional center can offer also job development, vocational training, and employment support to eligible clients. So pretty much most people who would qualify for one of these others of these are able to get the kind of supports they need to be thinking about what kind of job or what kind of work they might want to be doing in life. So just a few additional concerns, and then we will open up for questions for everybody. We went faster because there's only a few of us here tonight, which is nice for a Thursday night. But a few additional concerns to think about. Jean, go ahead. Did somebody have their hand raised? We're good?
No, I still have that question. I was just
Oh,
having
please,
trouble
go ahead.
unmuting. So is there a way to get a copy of the slides? I have some friends in California who I think would get so much benefit from this.
Sure. I mean, I will put my, actually, I will ask since Janet is here and working, I will say, Janet, please put this in my email in the chat for people, and then you can just ask me and I can email them to you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, glad to give them to you. So a few additional concerns that we think about for transition. One is accessing public benefits and financial supports for people who maybe are not going toward competitive employment, and the transition to adult healthcare providers for people who are have chronic health conditions is a really important one as well. So just to talk a little bit about an important transition issue for many students is whether they're going to be eligible for SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income. SSI provides eligible people with disabilities a monthly benefit to have their basic needs of food and shelter and clothing met. It is not a large amount of money, but it is something for people. I want to make sure people know about this because SSI is usually the first thing people apply for because it becomes a place to access other benefits from. They can help you access CalFresh food assistance, low-income Section 8 housing, and other benefits. There are an amazing number of things that are that give benefits to people, like free museum days, for example, if you have a CalFresh card, right? So there are a lot of things that are available out there. So getting SSI is really important. We were just talking about this at the office yesterday. It can be a complicated process. It is right now. We are hearing that it is a process that for um, some people has been very, very slow. And I expect that with the reduction in force that's going on across the federal government, that this is not going to go anywhere quickly. But it is something that you apply for after you are 18, because if you apply before you are 18, as my husband sadly found out for my son, then they evaluate your family's eligibility for it rather than just the child, right? And that puts you back about 6 months. So don't do that. Learn from us. Learn from our mistake. Don't do that. Medi-Cal coverage is one of the things that people often get from SSI. It is SSI. If you are eligible for SSI, you are automatically eligible for Medi-Cal. So that's an important thing to remember. But adults can remain on their parents' insurance till they're 26. Some employers, if the adult has a disability, will allow the adult with a disability to remain on insurance for as long as that person is employed, right? So that's an important thing to know as well. People also can get insurance from their college or university that they attend, but some adults do get that Medi-Cal linked from SSI, and that Medicaid provides all kinds of services for people. And it's important for people to be able to do that. I will say that one of the things that is a big challenge for many people is that finding providers who have worked with people with disabilities who survived into adulthood, especially for people with chronic health conditions like cerebral palsy, is very, very difficult, because there are not a lot of medical providers who are trained, because as one doctor so bluntly put it to me, because people like your child didn't survive, right? So this can be a challenge, and it is a really important one. If you remember back in the beginning of this, 1 in 4 adults with disabilities does not have a regular provider. And we all know that the medical home and having that regular provider is really important for people for people's wellness and well-being. So that's an important thing to think about as well. And our last slide for today is really just to kind of sum up. Post-secondary transition is really complicated, right? It can be really complicated for adults and for their families. Um, it should be really oriented toward people's needs. And this idea of transition planning, particularly if you insist on starting it at 14 or younger, like I did with my son, can really give you that space to explore, to discover, to figure out what this person's passion, what they want to do, what the work is they want, where do they want to live. All those kinds of things are an exploration, right? Not a final decision. So it's important for you to be thinking about those big goals, right? Whether it's for yourself as a person with a disability, or as for your family member, to help those big goals. And then the school's contribution to this are the year-to-year academic goals that get you to the next step. And to bring in all of these other providers that we just talked about, that will give you a way of figuring out, what are the next set of services? What are the next sets of things that this person needs to continue their progress into adult life? That. Okay.